The Black Sea has become one of the most dangerous battlegrounds of the war. Once considered Russia's secure naval domain, it's now a place where complacency can be fatal. Moscow's commanders have relied on heavily fortified positions, bristling with air defenses, convinced that Ukraine could never risk a direct strike so deep into contested waters. And still, Ukraine has a history of beating those odds. A Ukrainian helicopter took to the skies on a calm evening with an unlikely and reckless mission. The pilots were aware of the dangers. Anti-air systems were ready to destroy anything they saw, drones were continuously patrolling, and radar grids covered the area. Instant devastation could result from even a glimmer of movement above the tree line. But this mission demanded extreme risk. Why? Because intelligence suggested Russian naval leadership would be gathering aboard one of their floating command centers, so-called unsinkable fortresses. Destroying one would cripple logistics and strike directly at Moscow's confidence. Timing mattered. Russian officers, convinced of their safety, had begun to let down their guard. Ukraine had been watching, waiting, planning. Now, the window was open. The helicopter skimmed low over the Dnipro, its engines roaring just above the waterline. To Russian commanders, this was reckless. To Ukraine, it was the opening move in a plan so bold no one would believe what came next. The Dnipro River stretched out like a sheet of glass, catching the last orange streaks of the setting sun. The light shimmered in ripples across the water, broken only by the faint disturbance of a rotor wash. At a distance, the scene seemed calm, almost ordinary. Birds darted low across the reeds. Fishing boats rocked lazily along the banks. Nothing gave away that high above, a machine was racing toward the most dangerous airspace in Europe. The silhouette of a Mi-8 helicopter moved against the haze of evening. To anyone unfamiliar with its lines, it looked unremarkable. Just another old Soviet-era airframe, one of hundreds still flying decades after its prime. But inside, every second carried weight. The pilots were not on a patrol. They were on a mission with a single, razor-thin margin: stay alive long enough to trick the Russians into believing they had the battle under control. The cabin vibrated with the heavy thrum of the engines. Loose fittings rattled against the fuselage. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the sweat of men who understood what awaited them. Their machine was not stealthy. It was not fast. It was not equipped to stand toe-to-toe against modern Russian air defenses, and yet that was precisely why it had been chosen. The Mi-8 was bait. Its very presence on radar was unmistakable. It carried no illusions of invisibility. What mattered was not hiding, but being seen and surviving just long enough to hold the Russians' attention. Every jolt of turbulence, every flicker on the instrument panel was a reminder that they were flying into the jaws of a fortress. The pilots used every rise of terrain and curve of riverbank to mask their approach, dipping so low that their rotor wash kicked up trails of spray. The helicopter seemed to skim the skin of the water, barely above the treetops, hugging the folds of land to break up its radar profile. Yet inevitably there were moments when it had to climb, when its shadow stretched across the horizon, when it became visible on enemy screens. And that was when the trap began to close. In Taman Bay, one of Russia's most heavily defended naval bastions, radar operators hunched over glowing screens. Their consoles pinged with intermittent returns: an object here, gone there, then suddenly back again. To the untrained eye, it looked like clutter, perhaps a flock of birds, perhaps interference. But these men were trained to see patterns. A voice cracked through the command channel.
Attack confirmed.
Immediately, the base snapped to readiness. Soldiers scrambled to their stations. Orders barked across frequencies. Mobile Tor M2 units swiveled their launchers skyward. Pantsir S-1 crews powered up their 30mm cannons. Long-range S-300 batteries extended their search beams upward, probing for altitude. For Russia's doctrine, hesitation was fatal. Any contact was to be engaged, and so the first missile leapt skyward. Inside the Mi-8, the warning alarm shrieked. A piercing tone filled the cockpit. The pilot's eyes flicked to the threat indicator, then to his co-pilot. There was no time for words. The helicopter banked hard, tilting into a violent dive that rattled the fuselage. With a sharp pull, the co-pilot deployed countermeasures. A burst of flares ignited, trailing behind the aircraft like burning stars. The missile's seeker head, confused by the sudden bouquet of heat signatures, swerved toward the decoys. A split second later, the sky lit up in a white flash as the warhead detonated harmlessly. The blast wave hammered the Mi-8, shaking it violently. Warning lights flickered, instruments rattled in their housings, but the machine held together. The crew exchanged a brief glance, adrenaline coursing through their veins. No words needed, just the silent agreement to keep going. Seconds later, another shriek from the alarm, a second launch. This time, the helicopter's maneuvers grew even sharper. The pilot wrenched the stick, forcing the old airframe into turns that strained its design. Flares blossomed again, glowing against the dusk. The missile detonated early, showering fragments across the sky, close enough for the crew to feel the shock. That made 2 near deaths in less than a minute. And then the real onslaught began. Wave after wave followed. Missiles launched in rhythm, each one streaking into the sky, each one met with desperate flares and jinking turns. To the Russians, it looked like success was inevitable. Sooner or later, one of their salvos would land. To the helicopter crew, it was survival by seconds, by inches, by reflexes drilled to instinct. But after the third close call, the sequence blurred into something almost mechanical. Alarm, maneuver, flare, explosion, recovery, repeat. The air above the river became a theater of light and thunder. The Mi-8 was living on borrowed time. And yet, to the Russian commanders watching their screens, it looked like the battle was being won. Each failure only reinforced the sense that the intruder was running out of luck, that the kill was seconds away. Operators leaned closer to their scopes. Commanders demanded confirmation. The air defense network roared to life, every gun and missile aimed upward, exactly as Ukraine had planned. Inside the cockpit, the tension built to a suffocating pitch. Sweat rolled beneath helmets. Muscles locked from the constant jerks of evasive maneuvers. Ears rang from the unending alarms. The Mi-8 had become a machine of noise and vibration, a furnace of stress and adrenaline. The pilots knew they could not fight back. They could not fire. Their only weapon was survival. Each second bought was a second stolen from the Russians' situational awareness. Each missile wasted was a resource denied to their real target. The co-pilot stole a glance at the altimeter. They were flying so low that the helicopter's rotor wash sprayed the river into mist. At times, it felt as though they were carving across the surface of the water, skimming through death itself. "Still with me?" the pilot muttered under his breath, not to his partner, but to himself, to the machine, to the very idea of endurance. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, confidence was peaking. Commanders believed they had pinned the intruder down. Dozens of missiles had already been launched. Pantsir cannons lit up the sky with tracer rounds, streams of fire clawing upward in arcs of orange. S-300 radars swept furiously for higher targets. In every direction, the fortress looked skyward, and yet not a single set of eyes looked outward to the sea. Beneath the chaos, a small boat crept along the surface of the Black Sea. To a casual observer, it was harmless. No more than a fishing vessel hugging the coastline. But on its deck sat compact FPV drones, their frames no larger than a backpack, each armed with a shape-charged warhead. Their operators crouched low, hands steady on control sticks, eyes locked to monitors. Every minute that passed was a minute bought by the Mi-8's survival. Every flare, every missile, every wasted ruble was another sliver of opportunity. They waited for the signal. They waited for the Russians to be blinded by their own focus. Back in the cockpit, the alarms wailed again. Another missile inbound, another bank, another burst of flares. The explosion rocked the helicopter, fragments rattling against its fuselage. The pilot gritted his teeth. His arms ached from the strain. Fuel gauges dipped lower with every evasive maneuver. The Mi-8 was not meant for this kind of flight. Its frame groaned, panels creaked, rivets strained. The men inside could feel it coming apart beneath them. And yet, they pressed on, because their mission was never to strike. Their mission was to survive long enough to hold the enemy's gaze. From the Russian perspective, the kill seemed moments away. Operators reported repeated hits that were in fact near misses. Commanders demanded more launches. The doctrine was simple: overwhelm, saturate, eliminate. The fortress bristled with activity, its defenders consumed by the drama in the sky. But the truth was far more dangerous. The real strike hadn't even begun. At 2:50 p.m., the first drone lifted off from the boat's deck. Its rotors whirred quietly as it skimmed just meters above the waterline. To radar, it was invisible. To infrared, it blended perfectly with the sea's surface. Its small camera streamed a view of waves rushing past, the silhouette of the Buyan M corvette looming larger by the second. The operator's hands were steady. Every twitch of the joystick was precise. The drone accelerated, skimming lower, weaving with the contours of the waves. On its monitor, the ship's mast filled the frame. At 2:52 p.m., the first impact landed. The explosion tore through the corvette's radar tower. Antennas snapped, panels twisted, consoles below went dark. Sailors staggered as alarms blared in confusion. The fortress was blind. A second drone followed, this one aimed for the missile bay. Its warhead slammed into the deck with brutal force. Flames erupted, hatches buckled, hydraulic systems hissed. The Buyan M shuddered as though struck by a giant's fist. Smoke poured skyward. The proud corvette, once bristling with weaponry, now burned. Russian crews shouted in panic. Damage control teams rushed across the deck. Officers screamed orders over the roar of fire. Guns tried to respond, but without radar guidance, they were blind. The fortress that had looked so invincible minutes earlier had become chaos incarnate. And the Mi-8, its mission complete, turned away from the inferno. Battered but alive, it retreated westward, its role as bait finished. The true strike had landed. The fortress had fallen not to brute force, but to deception. At precisely 2:56 p.m., 8 minutes after the first missile launch, the Buyan M corvette drifted in smoke and flame, its systems silenced. What began as a high-risk gamble with a lone helicopter ended with one of Russia's most capable strike platforms disabled inside what Moscow had considered a sanctuary. The consequences rippled far beyond Taman Bay. With its radar tower destroyed and Kaliber missile systems crippled, Russia's local air defense net faltered. Ukrainian helicopters suddenly had more freedom to operate. The tactical map had been redrawn in less than 10 minutes. The strike was also a lesson in cost asymmetry. A warship worth hundreds of millions neutralized by drones smaller than a suitcase. A Soviet-era helicopter consuming a storm of million-dollar missiles. For every ruble Russia spent firing into the sky, Ukraine spent pennies to strike from the sea. This imbalance is the new logic of modern war, and it's not without precedent. In 1941, British bombers used radar chaff to lure German night fighters. In Kosovo, Serbian forces deployed decoys to waste NATO munitions. In Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenian defenses were blinded by drone saturation. The floating fortress operation belongs in that lineage. Deception as a weapon, attention as the true battlefield. For Ukraine, it was proof that ingenuity could erode Russian dominance. For Russia, it was a scar, a reminder that even their most fortified defenses had a blind spot. No fortress is absolute. No ship is truly unsinkable. And in the Black Sea, the balance of power can shift in just 8 minutes. You now know the facts, but strategy is meant to be debated. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next breakdowns and share your take on this operation in the comments. Because the analysis doesn't end with this video, it begins with you.